Hello, everyone. This is Gabriel. I'm broadcasting from Dubai. And in New York is Professor Stephen Kershnar. He is the author of many books, but one in particular that we'll be talking about today. It's Does the Pro-Life Worldview Make Sense? Abortion, Hell, and Violence Against Abortion Doctors. This is by the publishing house Routledge, which is quite famous. Hello, Professor. Welcome.
Hello, appreciate your having me.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
before we begin, let me show the cover of your book so that our readers, whenever they go to the bookstore or they cruise through Amazon, they know what we're talking about here. And after listening to this conversation, they see the cover, they say, this is the book that I will that I will buy. All
Very
right.
kind of you. Thank you.
Yes, yes. So how is the pro-life position inconsistent?
So the pro-life position is inconsistent for several reasons. One reason, so let me just go through a few inconsistencies and then the general pattern. First, in discussions of the pro-life position, they almost never want to charge the women who solicit and have abortions with first-degree murder. It's a little clear why not. Second, they don't think it's permissible to assassinate or kill abortion doctors. It's unclear why that's not the case. Third, they seem to have asymmetric views in terms of the wrongness of abortion as opposed to the wrongness of damaging a fetus for drinking and smoking. They seem to think that abortion is sort of less wrong than harming your fetus in these other ways. Fourth, and most importantly, I think the religious views are inconsistent with the pro-life position. In particular, if you are guaranteeing that your fetus goes to heaven, and there's a substantial chance that your fetus would not go to heaven, or would spend a substantial amount of time in purgatory, it doesn't make sense for those religious pro-lifers who think that some people go to hell or that some people spend time in purgatory. And then fifth, their position as to when the individual comes into existence is inconsistent with their religious views. In particular, they think that the individual comes to existence at conception, but at conception, there's not a thinking thing. It's unclear then why we should think there's a soul or why you're killing the individual early on in the fetal development. So 5 inconsistencies then. One has to do with what they think we should charge a woman with. Second, the way in which we treat physicians who perform them. Third, the way in which our attitudes towards different types of harming versus killing fetuses. Fourth, the inconsistent with religious views. And then fifth, problems with when the individual comes into existence.
Right. Let's begin with the religion thing. I mean, it seems to me that you're assuming a few things that some people would question. You assume that children that die go straight to heaven, but in ancient times and the Middle Ages, that wasn't the case. St. Augustine used to say that they would go to hell. And they came up with this idea of limbo afterwards, precisely in order to, let's say, soften this position. So I suppose most Christians today would agree that, yes, babies that are killed, they go straight to heaven. But if you remove that assumption, as it was the case during ancient times, what are we left with?
Sure. So an excellent point. What happens if you think that fetuses are going to hell? One, it's an odd view, right? I mean, normally we think that before you get sent to hell, you should do something that's blameworthy or deserving of it, or have some feature which would warrant you going to hell. It's a little hard to see why God would send a fetus to hell when he's not blameworthy or deserving of it.
Well, but there is original sin. That's what St. Augustine would have said.
Sure.
And because they were not baptized, so because right. The original sin doesn't, baptism doesn't remove the original sin, they go straight to hell.
Right, that's right. So one objection, so if that were true, then the argument would not work. But a couple things to notice. One, note that at least the Catholic Church thinks that you should hope that an unbaptized baby goes to heaven. And if you can hope that an unbaptized baby goes to heaven, it's a little hard to see what would morally distinguish an unbaptized baby from an unbaptized fetus. Second, it's an odd view. I mean, you do this original sin doctrine. The original sin doctrine is a little hard to follow, right? Why is it that one individual should suffer in virtue of what someone else did, or in virtue of a condition which is not under the individual's control? But in addition, there might be a question of whether there are levels of hell. If there were levels of hell, then even if a fetus did go to hell, if the hell was less severe than the hell that the individual who the fetus grew into stood a good chance of going to, it'd still be a benefit, and in fact, an infinite benefit. So even if you think the fetus goes to hell, still that's not going to defeat the argument if there are levels of hell. But again, note that it's an odd view, right? To rest your pro-life view on original sin, it's also a little unclear how well that fits with baptism, right? Baptism is supposed to cure original sin. It's a little hard to see how that works. And it's also a little bit hard to see how original sin is a plausible doctrine.
Right. Well, and let it be said that, I mean, this was St. Augustine in ancient times, and ever since he was limbo, and their Pope before this one, he said limbo doesn't exist either. So
Sure.
they're saying that, I mean, they clearly believe that unbaptized children, they go to heaven. Now,
let me just interrupt one thing. Notice if it were the case that fetuses were going to heaven, we'd really want to take massive precautions that we don't. So, for example, if your wife is pregnant, you really want to make sure that she doesn't leave the house, because on the off chance she were to, it'd be in a car accident, for example, and the fetus inside her were to die, then that fetus would spend an eternity in hell. That's too big a risk to take for wherever she wants to go in a car, right? Or wherever she wants to fly in a plane. The fact that we think these risks are permissible seems to suggest that we don't actually think the fetus is going to hell if it were to die before it came to term.
Now, this argument, it seems to me, it doesn't apply to abortion itself only. It applies to anybody who believes that children go straight to heaven because they have committed no sin. So someone could say, okay, I believe that after a child is born, let's say 6 months, he's still too young to be committing a sin. So if we kill the child at, let's say, 3 months old, he will also go to heaven. So by the same token, would this also justify infanticide?
Yes. So the reasoning is identical. Yep. So that's right. I mean, the idea is, if you're going to guarantee someone goes to heaven, the idea is, why would you not guarantee it? So here would be an analogy. I mean, imagine you have someone, a bridge is out. So assume that there's no afterlife, to keep the example simple. And you have someone who's approaching the bridge. You know the bridge is out, and they're going to go off and smash down into the ravine and die a horrible fiery death. You might think, look, if your child is in the car, there's at least some chance the car is going to stop before it hits the bridge that's out. But would you ever take the chance? No, you wouldn't. And here the loss is infinitely larger than if your child were to go over the bridge in the car and die in a fiery crash. So just like you would never let your child take that risk in a car, right? So if you'd stop the car if someone else was driving and say, look, you just can't go forward, even though there's at least some chance you would have noticed the bridge is out. This is even a greater risk. So why wouldn't you do that? But you're right. The same thing applies to infanticide as applies to abortion.
I suppose religious people would say the following. Well, yeah, a child who dies early and goes to heaven, that's a good thing. So theoretically, we should be killing all children. But an even greater good is for people to earn heaven on their own. So in that regard, it's better to let them live and let them earn salvation on their own instead of us doing them the favor, because that would be an even greater good. So what would you say to that?
Sure, two excellent points. So let me just say, one, it depends on your vision of heaven and hell. If you think that heaven and hell have an infinite amount of well-being for the individual, then it seems like you're right. Why would you ever take the risk? If you think it's sort of everlasting, that is, it's always finite. So, let's say it's infanticide. Your child would spend 1 year, then 2 years, then 3 years, 4 years, so on. In heaven, it's never going to hit infinity. There, you have to take into account the chance that the child will reproduce and what would happen to your child's children, right? So would they go to heaven or would they go to hell? So if they're finite values, you have to take reproduction and the outcomes of reproduction into effect. So it depends on which vision of heaven and hell you have, whether it has an infinite payoff for the individual or just an ever-increasing finite vision. In terms of it being better to earn heaven than to not earn heaven, I guess I think this is, I don't find this to be a plausible view. Here's why. I'm not sure why God would not let a fetus or an infant mature in heaven so that the fetus or infant couldn't earn his way once he's there. That is, what would be the reason for disallowing the individual once they're there to earn their way in heaven? But even if that were the case, there's still two gaps here, right? There's sort of earning heaven. Let's just say that's, for a simple model, 10 utils per year, being in heaven but not earning it, 5 utils per year, and being in hell, let's say negative 100 utils per year. Still, while it would be better for the person to earn their way in heaven, the gain from not earning your way in heaven, but being in heaven, would be significantly less than the loss if you were to go to hell. Now, if they're infinite payoffs, we're not going to be on probabilities. But if there are finite payoffs, we can bring in probabilities. So I guess I don't think that's a plausible view of how heaven works.
Well, they might say it's a risk worth taking. Yes, I mean, if we kill them, we only increase 5 and we run the risk of going down 100. But even though you are right that saying, well, if we compare losing 5 or losing 100, we better, we go with the safe side. They say, but it's still worth taking the risk, because even though the increase is not that much compared to how much you lose, it's still worth it.
Yeah, excellent. So a couple things to say about this. One is, it's not quite clear what makes it worth it unless we can assign probabilities and outcomes. It seems plausible, if we're just, kind of off the cuff, to say the difference between being in heaven and not earning it and being in heaven and earning it is probably smaller than the difference between one of those two outcomes and being in hell, right? But again, we'd have to add probabilities. It's not clear how we add probabilities into the calculation. But even if we could, again, it's an odd view, right? That God would say, look, to some fetus or some infant, once you're in heaven, you're going to stay at age 5 or stay at age 1 or stay at age 6 months in fetal development. Why? I mean, it's an odd view, right? It's unclear why that would be good for the fetus. It's unclear why that would be good for God. It's unclear why that would be good for a third party. And it's unclear why this would be required by something like desert or rights or fairness or any other sort of deontological consideration. So I think a religious person could say this. As a side note, they tend not to say it, but they could say this. But one, it doesn't seem to be like a rational judgment unless we have probabilities. 2, it just doesn't seem to be a plausible religious view, which I think is why religious folk tend not to say this, at least when I publicly discuss it.
Yeah, well, some church fathers, as far as I'm aware, they'd say if a child goes to heaven, he wouldn't stay a child. He would be about 35 because that's the ideal age. That's what they used to say. So I don't know if that takes care of that part of your argument.
Yeah. And that's an excellent point, right? That exactly supports my view. That in that view, God either allowed the fetus or the infant to mature or converted him over into the condition in which he or she is morally responsible for his action. So if that were the case, then on that vision, that sort of reason applies. Why would God leave the fetus at 7 months of development? Right. I mean, who's that good for? How is that just, fair, or deserved? It's a little hard to see what the case for it would be.
Sure. Let's move on to, I think, the biggest argument that you have, which is the thing about the people who bomb abortion clinics.
Yes.
Now you say, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but this is basically your argument. So if I'm misrepresenting you, please stop me. You say, if you are pro-life, you should think that these people are not terrorists, but they're freedom fighters. Because if you put it down to numbers, there is a mass genocide going on. And what these people are doing is they're actually trying to stop the mass killing, just as any guerrilla fighter would do against a Nazi regime or something like that, right? So they should actually be getting praise and they shouldn't be condemned by people in the religious groups who usually they say they're pro-life, but at the same time they say, oh, but we don't support people bombing abortion clinics. You say actually they should, right?
Yes, that's exactly my view.
Okay, so can you develop that a little bit more?
Yes. So here's an analogy, right? So imagine you are outside of one of the World War II death camps. Let's say it's Auschwitz, if you blink on, yeah. And you see one of the German executioners driving to work, and he's the Zyklon B specialist. So he's the person who dumps in the cyanide compound that's going to kill lots of naked Jewish women and children. Now, presumably, if he's about to dump the Zyklon B into the gas chamber, you could shoot him, right? It's self-defense. It's self-defense of innocence of large numbers. If he's on his way, he's about to enter the camp in his car, why would you have to wait till he's about to dump the Zyklon B? I mean, you don't have to wait to an enemy unjust combatant actually starts to fire his weaponry before you can act in self-defense. Now, how then would an abortion doctor who's at work or is on his way to work be any different? In both cases, you have individuals, they're intentionally killing innocents on the pro-life position. There's no justification or excuse that's present. Even if there were an excuse, it would be beside the point. But in fact, there is no justification or excuse. You're doing the killing in order to save the innocents. It will in fact save the innocents. It's a little hard to say why they are not parallel. So the pro-lifer who opposed to shooting abortion doctors has to say one of two things. Either you may not shoot the German executioner on his way to the Auschwitz death camp. I should say Nazi executioner. On the Nazi executioner on the way to the death camp. Or you may do so, but there's some moral dissimilarity. But on the pro-life position, there is no moral dissimilarity.
I think, well, they may say there is, and I want to bring one point here. They may say that the analogy is not perfect because there was no legal way for the Nazi to stop doing this, whereas there is a legal way for the abortion doctor to stop doing this. I mean, like in your country, now you have a Supreme judge who may actually overturn things. So from the religious side, they would say, let's wait, because there is a way that we can work this out through legal ways, which was not available in the Nazi case.
Yeah, I mean, this is an odd view. One is it was legally reversible during the Nazi regime. In fact, was not, but I mean, it could have been reversed. I mean, they had, at least in some sense, law. They could have criminalized it or reversed it. But even if it were not the case, I mean, the numbers we're talking like 40 million abortions. I mean, the numbers are just astounding. If this really was the equivalent of gunning down, kindergartners, then it's hard to see why you would have to wait till the law changed. For example, if in the US, we authorize the US military to slaughter some group of children, and you say, look, I mean, it's possible to reverse this legally. All right, but why should we have to wait until they work their way through tens or hundreds of thousands or millions of children before the legal gears get moving or the legislature changes its rule? It just, one, I think the same thing applies then to Nazi Germany. They could have changed the law as well. But two, even if this were not the case, even if there were dissimilarity in law, the numbers are too stark for it to make a difference.
Right. So would you, I mean, I'm not asking you to praise the people who put these bombs, but would you say they have conviction, they believe in what they do, and maybe as the law stands right now, maybe there should be some attenuating factors in saying they did this out of their own conscience?
So here's what I think. My focus is that they're doing that. If the pro-life position is true, they're doing the right thing. The blameworthiness of praising is a separate issue. So what I think is dead wrong and sort of a common error is pro-lifers seem to say, look, what they're doing is wrong. It's just not true. From their position, it follows that it's permissible. A separate issue as to whether they're praiseworthy or blameworthy. Generally, I think true believers are not blameworthy for what they do, whether it's in this context or some other context, simply because you cannot be blameworthy for ignorance. Right? So you don't know what you don't know. So I tend to think they're not blameworthy. This applies to lots of true believers out there committing evil. But, I think that's true. I don't think they're especially blameworthy, but even if they were blameworthy, I just don't think that affects the rightness or wrongness of their action.
So they would have to go to prison, nevertheless.
Well, is an issue as to whether or not we should send people to prison if they were doing the right thing and were not blameworthy for doing so. I mean, you might think that would be a case under law of a case of justification. It's a necessity defense, right? They're doing the lesser of two evils. It's also the case that they're not blameworthy, they're not subjectively culpable. So given that they neither performed the wrongdoing nor were they blameworthy or culpable, it's hard to see why they would warrant punishment. They wouldn't warrant punishment because they have an affirmative defense, namely justification. But even if they didn't have a justification, it seems that they would not have the sort of blameworthy mental state that would warrant punishment. Let me just give a quick analogy. If I think someone's attacking loved ones, but they're not, I mean, it just looks that way. I draw reasonable inference. I draw my gun and defend my loved ones. You might think that I should not be punished under law, even though I did the wrong thing because I did not have a blameworthy mental state.
Well, I mean, I see your point, but doesn't this apply also to any other religious fanatic who might say, oh, like, for instance, let's say in the Muslim world and someone puts a bomb in an alcohol shop and say, oh, the Quran says you're not allowed to drink and, you're breaking God's law. And that's what I've been taught since I was a child. Yeah, but I wouldn't think you're off the hook with that excuse.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. Look, if you think that's subjective, I mean, this is why I think as a matter of law, it's probably the case that you should not, blameworthiness or culpability should not be a condition other than you're being responsible for the act. What's interesting in the pro-life case, though, is given their position, the pro-life assassin is doing the right thing, and not like just clearly the right thing. So it's just a classic necessity defense, right? A classic lesser of two evils, or classic defense of others, if you want to think whether or not the two are separate. In the case of an extremist who sort of blows up some store, you might think, look, I mean, it's just hard to see how that follows from, at least it's an open issue as to whether it follows from a coherent body of beliefs. But if it were to do so, then those people would have a hard time prosecuting that individual. It's a separate issue as to what the state should do.
Right. Let's move on to some of the other inconsistencies that you mentioned. You say that a woman who drinks and smokes while she's pregnant, she's not liable to prosecution. But you say that if the fetus is a person, this would be a direct harm to a person. Therefore, she should be prosecuted. And yet she's not. So that's another inconsistency.
That's right. And in addition, we have a very different attitude, right? When you see someone drinking or smoking who's pregnant, at least in the few cases I've seen this, in the case I've heard about, people get very upset at that woman, right? They were harshly critical of her. But oddly enough, they're not harshly critical of women that they find out are about to have or have had an abortion. Well, presumably it's worse to kill someone than to harm them by, slowing down their development and why would be have a much harsher attitudes of the former action than the latter? It's not clear. And you're right. The fetus were an individual, whether it's a person or an individual, depending on what you think the relevant object is. You might think, well, why would you not punish them?
Well, I mean, someone might say that in abortion, you're directly targeting the fetus by killing that person, whereas in smoking and drinking, it's a collateral effect. So therefore, your moral responsibility, it's lower in the case of smoking and drinking because you're not directly intending to harm the fetus. It's just a collateral effect of your reckless behavior, but your intention is different. Whereas in abortion, you do have the intention of killing. And I mean, I know that some philosophers and ethicists don't really care much about intentions, but for those that do, isn't there a difference here?
Yes. So if you think that attention matters, it seems there's a difference between directly targeting and indirectly targeting. Nonetheless, we punish under law pretty severely when you have a reckless activity. For example, if you are firing your gun up in the air and you're told, look, those bullets might come down and kill someone, and you do it anyway. you get quite a severe penalty for that, even though you're not going to be punished as severely as if you had as your purpose, your goal and means to your goal to kill someone. We also have transferred intent, right? You go to shoot A, you miss, you kill B. Well, you didn't really intend to kill B, but we treat it as if you did. We have felony murder rules, right? If you're committing a felony, someone dies in the midst of that, we think, okay, look, we're going to punish you pretty severely, even though, again, it wasn't your intention to kill anyone. So I think you make a good point, and it is the case that direct targeting is going to have, it seems to have at least greater blameworthiness. And under law, we punish that more severely, but it doesn't mean we don't punish the other thing.
Yeah, as far as I know, in the US and other countries, there are some groups pushing for legislation where if you harm your fetus by smoking and drinking, then that becomes a punishable offense.
Sure.
So in that regard, at least they would be more coherent if they pass those laws.
Yes, that is right. But and again, I don't know anything about that movement, but notice it's a fairly severe attack. I mean, it's not just a battery. It's kind of grievous bodily harm, right? If you were to hit someone with a tire iron so that they never think properly again, or they don't develop physically well at all, that's a fairly severe felony when you do that to someone after birth. If they were consistent, they would have a fairly severe punishment if you did that to a fetus. In addition, under American law, in some cases, if you are threatening grievous bodily harm, under some cases, you can use lethal self-defense. So this would, again, warrant the sort of, fairly severe violence to prevent this from happening.
Right. All right. So far we've mentioned the inconsistency regarding going to heaven, the inconsistency of people bombing abortion clinics, the inconsistency of punishing or not punishing women who smoke and drink. Refresh my memory because there are two left.
Yeah. So an additional one is that we don't charge the women who are procuring abortions with first-degree murder. And that's just similar to the abortion doctors, right? I mean, if you're soliciting a murder, or if you're ordering it, let's say that you're a mafia don and you're ordering a murder, we think that's a fairly severe crime. We punish you very severely. In fact, oftentimes we hold you guilty of murder, even though you yourself didn't pull the trigger. And also then there's just the metaphysics, right? So a lot of people think that, look, abortion occurs even when you use a, RU46 or the abortion pill, right after conception. And the view is, well, an individual begins to exist at conception. But it's a little hard to see why that is, right? I mean, if you hold a religious view and you think that someone exists after their earthly existence in the form of a soul or in the form of a person who has a new body, presumably what exists is continuing consciousness, right? So there's a conscious feature that's distinct either for when the soul exists or the nature of the soul, or for what it is for you to be able to switch from one body to a new body. But at conception, as far as I can tell, there's no reason empirically or even conceptually to think that you have a thinking thing. So why would the pro-life position think that an individual comes into existence at conception? That is, someone who thinks you're an animal can accept that, but it's not clear that animalism is going to be consistent with the afterlife. So they have this view. Do they think that there is an afterlife? If so, then it's hard to see why a conceptus or a very young, why a zygote or a very young fetus would in fact be an individual that eventually develops into a person. Yeah.
So you're saying that the fetus is not a person because it still doesn't have a mental life?
Well, early fetuses, yes. So at the conceptus or the zygote or the embryo, yeah, and then the early fetal, sure.
There is a very common objection that's made. That what about people who are in coma or persistent vegetative state? Should they be killed, but not killed by pulling the plug, but actually deliberately killed?
But notice the people in a persistent vegetative state or a coma or have dreamless sleep, notice those individuals have the capacity, right? They have both the structure and the capacity to think. At conception and at the zygotic and embryonic stage, there's no capacity for thought. So it's a little hard to see on what would be if there's no seat of consciousness there, so that consciousness is impossible, why would we think the individual exists that early on?
I'm not sure that someone in a persistent vegetative state would have the capacity, because I mean, the upper part of the brain would be dead. The lower part is still working, so you can breathe and so on, or you know, but not have executive function. And in very, very few cases do they ever come back. It's a very small percentage. So I mean, I think that could be a little challenge, because you say, well, someone in a persistent vegetative state, at least they have the capacity to think. But I think most physicians would say, no, they don't. When the upper brain is dead, it's dead.
Okay, so if it's dead, so if you had like someone like, let's say you had a case where the cerebrum liquefied, right? So there's no upper brain. Yeah, in that case, I would say the individual's gone. So at least on the pro-life position, right? Other people could say, look, an individual exists when, you know, they're an animal, so when they're alive. Or they can say they exist when there's a brain, even if it's severely disabled. But if you believe in the afterlife, so the consciousness is going to be, in some sense, closely tied to your existence, it's a little hard to see how then you could say that, you know, if your cerebrum liquefied, you're still there. In virtue of what are you still there? And in cases where the cerebrum doesn't liquefy, right, where it's there, it's just not functioning, or you're in dreamless sleep, or you're frozen down to absolute zero, so you're not thinking at the time. In that case, it seems that, look, you do have the capacity, and the fact that, you know, some people do recover, whatever the small percentage, seems the capacity is there, even if it doesn't get actualized.
Can you make the difference between what you mean by capacity and potential? Because some pro-lifers would say, well, the fetus also has the capacity, because later on, they will turn into an adult and they will be able to think. So someone might be confused here when you use the capacity, and they might be thinking, well, but it's the same as potential, isn't it? And if a fetus is potentially a person, then we ought to respect the life of the fetus. So go ahead and make that difference, because I think it's important.
So excellent. Yeah, so I think there's a really important distinction between potentiality and capacity. Potentiality means in the future you might have a property. Capacity means that you have the property right now. So for example, it's not my example, but if you are the president, you have the capacity to order certain change in the country, right? You can sort of order your armed forces into alert. If you are merely running for office, you have the potential to do this, but you don't have the capacity to do it. A zygote or an embryo has the potential to think, but it does not have the conditions which allow it to think. That is, it doesn't have the enabling conditions. Whereas someone in dreamless sleep, someone in a coma, someone frozen down to absolute zero, that person has the capacity to think, even if they're not actualizing it at that point. So I think there's an important difference between saying that you will have a property in the future and that you have it now. Now, capacity might be important not by the capacity itself, but because of what it allows you to think. Still, the difference is the capacity means you have the conditions right now to think, even if you're not exercising them. Whereas the potentiality says that you do not have the conditions which allow you to think, although you may have them in the future.
You know, there is a related inconsistency that I don't think you mentioned in the book, or you haven't mentioned it now, but I'd like to bring it here up to you to hear your thoughts, which is about in vitro. I've been surprised to find a lot of pro-lifers who do not have a problem with in vitro. And I don't know, maybe they're just ignorant, and they don't know that in the overwhelming majority of cases, the embryos are discarded, right?
Sure.
That could explain it. And once you explain it to them, then they might change their position. Although I've explained it to them and they don't change their position. They still hold on to being pro-lifers, even after being aware of what goes on with in vitro. But some other people, they are aware of what in vitro is about, but they say, well, but somehow abortion is different or worse. And, you know, it's a mystery to me, because I still don't see what the difference is. So how much of an inconsistency is this to be against abortion, but at the same time to say, well, in vitro is okay? And as far as I know, in countries like the US and Canada and Europe and other countries, when they do polls, the percentage of disapproval of abortion is much higher than the percentage of disapproval of in vitro procedures, right?
Yes. So an excellent point. Yeah. So I have not thought through this. That's an excellent point, and I appreciate it. So my sense is that perhaps there could be a distinction on the doctrine double effect. And in vitro fertilization, if you allow the fetus to kind of die on its own, you're not directly targeting it, whereas abortion is a targeting. Still, we should have problems with in vitro fertilization, as you point out. That is, if you were creating, let's say you created children rather than fetuses, so sort of full-grown children somehow, and you said, look, we create, for every 5 of them we create, only 1 is unfrozen, right? The rest die in a frozen state. You might think, well, that's pretty horrendous. I mean, that's, you don't want to allow children to sort of exist in a frozen state and then kind of die. I mean, why would you be creating vastly large more numbers of children, only a percentage of which are you going to let live and develop? Yeah, I mean that'd be problematic. I mean, it's an excellent point. But I do think that at least some religious, philosophers, theologians, lawyers would say that the difference would be direct targeting and doctrinal effect.
Well, no, and at least the Catholic Church here is consistent because they oppose in vitro.
Right.
So in this regard, at least, we can tip our hats towards the Pope or whoever it is that calls the shots there in saying, well, at least in this case, you're being consistent.
Right. Although I'm not sure that their opposition to it isn't consistent with the notion that abortion's worse because of the doctrinal effect, because of the direct targeting. But yeah, I mean, it seems to be atrocious to creating individuals that you think has, I don't know what percentage of in vitro fertilized, zygotes or embryos develop. But if it's a small enough number, you might, even if it's not a small number.
No, it's not small. It's high. Yeah. For every in vitro embryo that goes on to develop as a person, about 10 or 11 are discarded.
Yeah,
so I mean, it is a high number.
You might think that's just unacceptable, regardless of the direct targeting. Because again, you can't take, it's still bad to take things which knowingly waste individuals' lives, even if it's not intended.
Let me get back before we move on to the final inconsistency, because we've addressed 4 of them. But sure. Related to this, let me get back for a second, if I may, to the thing about potentiality. Why isn't potentiality important in your view? Because, I mean, that's where the big argument hinges for religious people. They say, yeah, we acknowledge that a fetus is not thinking, but it has the potential to think, and potentiality is very important. So why do you say that potentiality is not important in personhood?
So I think potentiality, I think that there's a metaphysical error going on here. Potentiality means that you will have a property in the future. It's a little hard to see why you can be valuable now on the basis of a property that you have in the future. So that's the problem with potentiality. But in addition, there are just cases, I mean, if we're talking about potentiality, there are logically possible potentials which are not very plausible, but they are possible. I mean, you have a case with Michael Tooley where he says, look, imagine that a kitten is such that if we were able to shoot them with just the right serum, they would eventually develop into a person. Now he says, look, I mean, it's extremely unlikely. It's not even clear it can happen in the actual world, but it's possible. So it's hard to see why that would make the kitten valuable. But the more general point is, you can't be valuable now on the basis of a property that you have in the future. It seems that what makes you valuable has to be the value-making property has to be present. Otherwise, you have kind of the entailment of the property. I mean, you're valuable without having property that makes it so. So that's why I think potentiality is not a value-making property.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I absolutely agree. Like if someone masturbates and then the semen is there and they wipe it off, I mean, those sperms are potentially someone later on, right?
No, I think that's a really good point, right? I mean, you think, look, if you have a test tube, if you have sperm in one test tube and eggs in another, and you put them right near each other, but you don't combine them, would you think, well, look, that's a really valuable thing because they have the potential to become an individual?
Right.
And some people say,
even now with cloning technologies, I mean, any cell could potentially be a human being. So every time you wipe off a piece of hair, you're throwing away cells there that potentially could be human beings, right? So you're committing genocide every time you go to the barber or something like that.
Yes. No, I think that's exactly right. And yeah. So, and some people would say, well, the individual exists, whereas in the case of the 2 test tubes, there's no individual there. But look, again, one, on some theories, you might think the egg is what develops into the individual, but assuming that's not the case, it's just hard to see why you would think. I think that's in general true, right? Why would you have a property now on the basis of some feature that you'll have in the future? I mean, where else do we think this is true? Whether it's in morality or in metaphysics, it's hard to see. You're conscious now in virtue of having some property in the future. You have rights now in virtue of having some property in the future. I mean, it's just hard to see how that would work in metaphysics.
Yeah, but in everyday, let's say folk metaphysics, like in everyday speech, some people
Yes.
do say, oh, you've robbed him of his future, or you took
Right.
away his future from him. So, I mean, I don't know if they're being sloppy in the way they think, but this is a common assumption in everyday speech, that whenever you do something to someone and that changes the course of their life, you've done great harm because you are depriving them of where they were going. And that's a great harm that you are doing to that person.
Yes. So that's a really good point, right? The deprivation of a valuable future. But a couple things about that. One, that's not going to get us anywhere towards establishing that an early fetus or a zygote, an embryo, is the individual, right? So we sort of kick back into that issue. But in addition, what it seems to say is the relevant property is having the valuable future. Okay, I mean, someone could go that. It's a little bit of an odd view, right? Imagine that you have a child, and because of Tay-Sachs, the child's going to die at age 5. Now, that child does not have a valuable future. Does that mean that it doesn't have rights or doesn't have value? I mean, you can have that position, but it's an odd view that you have. Again, it's just an odd metaphysics, but it's an odd view too that people would seem to lose their rights or importance based on facts about their future.
Right.
So, yeah.
All right. So if you could please refresh my memory. So we've covered inconsistencies regarding hell, inconsistencies regarding bombing of abortion clinics, inconsistency of women who smoke, inconsistency of killing the fetus itself. What's the final inconsistency?
That we don't charge women who procure abortions with murder. In fact, we don't charge them with first-degree murder. But if it looks very much like they're hiring a hitman, I mean, they look very much as if it's a case of murder for hire. And no one seems to think, yeah, and by the way, when we institute our pro-life regime, we're really going to have to start handing out life sentences for the women who have abortion. Or perhaps in those states which have the death penalty, we should start executing them, right? No one seems to put this forth. But why? I mean, if you had someone who was soliciting a contract killer to kill a child, we think, especially if they did this, with in a cold, calculated manner, you might think, well, why wouldn't we charge them first-degree murder? And no one seems to suggest this. It's a little unclear why. When you ask them, they seem to say a couple things. One, it's just they usually say that just sounds too harsh, which all right. I mean, I hear what they're saying. Two, they seem to say, well, the women are under a lot of stress, so they don't have full blameworthiness. It's kind of an odd view, right? I mean, they don't seem as if they are impaired, that they lack, they're incompetent in some way or have diminished capacity. So kind of an odd view. And the third view is,
yeah, but let me interrupt you there if I may. You were making a similar argument regarding people who put bombs in abortion clinics, into saying, well, they don't really know what they're doing, or at least based on their context, that's what drove them to do that. So maybe they could be, to a certain degree, moral excuse. Why doesn't that argument apply also to the women who kill?
Okay, so just to be clear, on those sorts of cases where you act in good faith, but your beliefs are wrong and you're acting in a wrongful manner, there, I think that should not be a legal excuse. It's a moral excuse, but not a legal excuse. So, for example, if Stalin or Hitler was a true believer that what he was doing was correct, he did his due diligence and the best he could determine that's the correct thing to do, I do think it's the case to say that the person is not blameworthy, right? Why? Because you cannot be blameworthy for ignorance unless there's some sort of act which led to your being ignorant. But whether you're morally blameworthy is different from whether you're legally blameworthy. And what I would say about the people who shoot abortion doctors, I would say, look, we should punish them. Even if they're not morally blameworthy, they should be legally liable to punishment. What I would say is, were pro-life assumptions to be true, then we in fact should severely punish the women who solicit abortions. We should do that, successfully procure abortions. We should do that even if they're not blameworthy. It's not clear they're not blameworthy, though, because I think that most women who have abortions, they deliberate back and forth. They're aware of this position. They address it. In some cases, they decide, well, maybe it's the wrong thing to do, but it's the thing I'm going to do. So I don't think that, at least in some cases, it parallels the case of a committed killer. But even if it did, I would say we should punish both.
Yeah, and even some religious texts on which these people rely, they say what you're saying. There's a famous text in Exodus, I think, where Moses' law says that if you hurt a woman who's pregnant and the woman aborts as a result of that, you're not really committing a crime. You have to pay some compensation, but it's not like life with life as it was in ancient Israel if you kill someone, right? So there, it's tacitly acknowledging that you're not killing anybody. But for some reason, those texts they've been removed from doctrine, or they've become sort of an embarrassment for pro-lifers. Now, there might be a way out, because I've heard some religious people make this argument. Maybe you're assuming that personhood, it's discrete. You're either or you're not. What about if it comes in degrees? And yes, let's say that I acknowledge that a fetus is not a person, but still warrants protection for many other reasons. Maybe, well, because it's an animal who still doesn't have mental life, but it's still human, right? Maybe not person, but human. Maybe for that particular reason, a human deserves protection. Not the full protection that you and I deserve, but protection nevertheless, or at least some minor dose of protection. So can we accept personhood or at least being under protection as a matter of degrees? And in that regard, someone could say, well, abortion is not murder, but it's still a punishable offense.
Right. So an excellent point. So let me make 2 points of this. One, I actually do think that personhood is a matter of degree, but being an individual that has rights or has a valuable life, it's not clear that is a matter of degree. But here's the kind of general analogy. Even the people hold that like personhood is a matter of degree, you can have more or less of it, fetus has done that much of it. They generally think that, look, if you are walking into a neonatal ward and you are shooting newborn babies, that's pretty horrendous, right? And we can kill you to stop you from shooting those newly born babies, right? It's very wrong. We can use lethal force. So is there a moral difference even on this continuum view between a baby and a fetus? It's a little hard to see there's that much of a difference. So if we think that killing babies, intentionally killing babies, newborn babies, is really wrong, and in some cases really blameworthy, and that there's not a major, there's probably not even a minor difference between a sort of a mid to late term fetus and a baby, still it's sufficiently wrong to make everything that I've said before true. So I think, look, even if you acknowledge this, it doesn't stop any of the implications. But what's more, sometimes it cuts in the opposite direction. That you might think that what's valuable for an individual, if you have, so a standard view, I'm not sure I accept this view, but if you have the deprivation view, that what makes an individual valuable is that they have this valuable future. Well, then a baby has more of a valuable future than a 50-year-old. And a 50-year-old has less of a valuable future than a 75-year-old. So if you were to have this common view, which you see in Don Marquis and others, that what makes an individual valuable is their valuable future, then it would cut in the opposite way. Then what you'd want to say is, well, actually the value making or right making feature is present to a greater degree in the fetus or the baby than it is to someone in their middle age, and present in a greater degree in their middle age than to someone who's older. So I think one, even if the continuum view is true, the baby case shows that it's really beside the point. And two, if you have a view which is commonly put forth, a Marquis-like view, it's going to cut in the opposite direction.
All right, so leaving the inconsistency issue aside, and to wrap it up, what's your view of the fetus? What status should it have? Does it become a person during pregnancy, or birth is the point when it becomes a person? And what are the legal implications of your views?
So, in terms of the fetus, what I think is that the fetus does not have rights. Why not? Because I think you need to be autonomous to have rights.
At no point. So 9 months fetus does not have
No,
rights.
at no points, no.
Okay.
So if you don't hold that, if you hold that it's the mere having of utility or a valuable future, there's going to be other problems that kick in. But I would say the fetus does not have rights because the fetus is not autonomous. If you thought that, even if you thought the fetus was valuable, though, so a common view that I run into, or people say, no, the fetus is valuable because, you know, it has utility at the time, or it has a valuable future, the Marquis view. Even if you think that, I still think abortion is permissible. Why? Because the fetus is a bodily invader. And I think, one, the fetus does not have a right to be inside the woman. And two, because a bodily invasion is a severe enough trespass on the woman's rights that she may use lethal force to remove it. So even if the fetus were valuable, even if the fetus were every bit as valuable as you and me, it's still the case that abortion would be permissible. Why? Because you have a unconsented to bodily invasion.
Well, but didn't the woman consent by having sex? Didn't she bring the fetus in? It's different from crashing in uninvited than bringing someone in, and then once you're in, you say, you know what, I have to kill you.
Yeah, so in some cases she didn't invite the fetus in, right? Just because you know there's a chance that something's going to happen doesn't mean that you consented to it. So I used to live in Detroit. I used to run at midnight. People say, what are you, crazy running at midnight? You know, you're taking all these risks. You're taking a big risk that you're going to get, you know, severely beaten running on the streets of Detroit, you know, at 1 a.m. Well, I knew I was taking the risk, but that doesn't mean that I consented to it. So a woman having sex without contraception who doesn't intend to get pregnant, it's a little hard to see why she consented to be pregnant, even if she took the risk. Second, even if she did consent, which I didn't think she did, you can certainly withdraw the right. For example, if a woman is having sex with a man and she sort of loses interest, whatever, you know, things are in her mind, she's not enjoying it, she can withdraw consent, right? She say, I hereby withdraw my consent for you to be inside me. And there doesn't be anything wrong with that. After that, he no longer has the right to be inside of her, so he can withdraw consent. And third, we wouldn't say this in the case of rape, but it's a little hard to see why abortion rests on the way in which a woman gets pregnant. So I guess I have a three-part, to abortion, 3 parts. One, the woman didn't consent in cases where she didn't intentionally get pregnant. Even if she did consent, she would withdraw consent. And third, the case of rape shows that consent really isn't the issue at hand here. When I discuss these with pro-lifers, they tend not to fight too hard on this. They tend not to claim, well, the fetus has a right to be inside the woman. What they instead say is that abortion is too much force. They concede in effect.
Can you evict? I mean, you can evict peacefully.
Right. And the question is this too much force? And my view is no. Just like you could evict someone who is having you could use lethal force, prevent someone from having unconsented to sex with you. And a fetal invasion is as great an invasion as unconsented to sex. So because you can use lethal force to prevent unconsented to sex, you can use lethal force to prevent unconsented to pregnancy.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're renting your apartment and you have people living inside and you say, okay, here's the eviction order, and you know they refuse to leave, wouldn't you try to persuade them first and then maybe push them out, but not kill them, just remove them from the place, but find some way for them to live somewhere else, or at least not take their life? So wouldn't that support the idea that abortion, by this analogy, is too harsh compared to the way that invaders are usually evicted from houses and so on?
Right. So I think you make an excellent point. Right. So normally we think, look, you cannot use lethal force if lesser force is available. So just like, you know, you can, and also it depends on what's at stake, right? Even if you couldn't evict someone, doesn't mean you can kill them to get out, you know, if they're a trespasser. But here we have a fairly severe rights trespass. Namely, it's a bodily trespass. It's a fairly grievous one. In addition, yeah, I mean, I think this suggests that if we could remove the fetus without using lethal force, that might be required. In fact, we don't have the technology to do so. And given that we don't have the technology to do so, it seems that the choices we have are lethal, lethal defense of bodily invasion, or allowing an unconsented to invasion. It does not seem to me that a woman is morally required to allow an unconsented to bodily invasion.
Yeah, but I mean, I can imagine the pro-lifer saying, but just wait a few months. Sure, we don't have the technology, but just wait a few months, give birth, and then you get rid of it. Just as a property owner, if the people inside would say, look, we can't go out, but if you give us 4 or 5 months, we'll go out, then presumably a judge could say, well, I mean, if that's the only way that they can survive, then let's just wait for the 4 or 5 months. And then after that, you get back to your own house.
Yeah, I mean, no, we don't say this though, but so this is why I think it matters whether or not an unconsented to pregnancy is more similar to rape or whether it's more similar to a trespass in a house. So for example, imagine a woman is being victimized by a rapist. And let's say she used lethal force to sort of remove him, right? So she takes, I don't know, a scissor and jams it into his neck and kills him. Imagine someone said to her, well, look, you could have just let him finish up. I mean, how much longer was he going to take? And you might think, well, that's true. But the fact of the matter, it's a very severe bodily invasion. And you're not required to allow it to continue. And my view is, look, allowing 7 more months of a bodily invasion is just not something that you should be required to tolerate. And I have a kind of an argument an additional argument as to why a unconsented to pregnancy is has a similar sort of magnitude as rape, in that, you know, if you had, let's say, again, returning to the Auschwitz example, let's say you had a young Jewish woman and they give her a choice. You can either have sex with a Nazi officer, or you can carry the Nazi officer's and his wife's child for 9 months. You could see the woman saying, you know, it's a tough choice. It's a tough choice because they're roughly equal bodily invasions.
Right. So you're saying that the fetus, even if the fetus is a person, it still has no right because of the invader status.
Well, yeah, or it forfeits its right. Yes.
All right. Now, let me get back to, because you provided a second argument, and we can wrap it up here, but I want you to take care of this argument. You provided a second argument to say that the fetus does not have a right. You were saying, well, because it's not a full person, because it's not fully autonomous. Now, what about people who are not autonomous in many other ways, but we still acknowledge that they're persons? Let's say someone who's connected to a dialysis machine, or someone who, you know, someone who is intellectually disabled, and
Right.
those persons need, you know, to be taken care of by competent adults and so on. I mean, in none of those cases are they autonomous, I presume. I mean, I might be mistaken, but if I am, please correct me. I presume that you would not favor like killing someone with Down syndrome or something like that, right?
So take the case of severe cognitive disability, right? So it's an odd view, right, that we think, okay, look, you know, a chimpanzee or a gorilla, which might have similar cognitive or emotional capacity as someone with a very severe cognitive disability, that's not a person, but the human being who has, let's say they have identical capacities is. Well, in virtue of what would one be a person and not the other? Someone could say, well, biologically, you know, a chimpanzee or a gorilla or bonobo is not a human being, but biological categorization is sort of like race or sex. It's hard to see how that's morally relevant. And if it's not morally relevant, then it seems what is the right maker? If you thought that chimps or gorillas, or if you don't like that, you know, like whatever, you know, pigs or dolphins, if you think those are not people, they don't have rights, then whenever you have a human being with a parallel capacity, it's a little hard to see what would make that human being have rights. Again, unless you brought into you brought in biological categorization, but that seems to be arbitrary. I mean, why should biological categorization matter?
So where do you draw the line in this? Because I can imagine some people who might have Down syndrome or are intellectually disabled who do have the cognitive level of a chimpanzee, and you're saying that if we can kill chimpanzees, then is the implication that we can kill, you know, severely mentally retarded?
I mean, yeah, it's not clear we should be killing either, right? Just because of the disutility involved. But in terms of rights, the idea is either they both have rights or neither has rights. And if we think that neither have rights, it's a little hard to see what the right-based feature of killing them would be. It might be wrong because it just, you know, brings about a lot of negative utility. But that's kind of a separate explanation, and that we apply in a fairly inconsistent manner, right? So yeah, it's just hard to see what it is that would be the right maker if it's not autonomy, right? Because again, I mean, lots of non-human animals have plenty of utility, right? Some of them have probably fairly complex emotional lives. So it's a little hard to see why, if rights apply to, emotional complexity or pleasure or things like that, why right makers wouldn't expand very quickly and to a fairly significant degree. If you think that they don't have rights, or that they don't have the rights that we have, the rights are either not the same, or they're the same but not as stringent, it's a little hard what to say why we wouldn't say that about human beings who have parallel capacities.
All right, so let's close with the final point that I wanted to ask you about. So, what are the legal implications of all this? What do you think should the law say regarding not only abortion, because you've also brought the issue of people who might be mentally incapacitated, and animals. So what should the law say about the killing of those three entities, or not to call them persons?
So what about say about abortion,
yeah,
shooting abortion doctors, and the severely disabled?
Yes. No. What should be the legal status, in your view, based on your ethical views, of doctors who practice abortions? I mean, I suppose that you support the American law as it is, that let's say that abortion should be legal.
Yes, and in fact, I think it should be legal up to 9 months.
Right. Okay. Now, regarding people who kill abortion doctors, you say they still should be punished, but morally they could be a little bit more excused because they have a more coherent worldview, or at least they haven't figured out that they're acting on a consistent basis. So yes, they should be punished, but morally speaking, let's say we shouldn't be so harsh against them.
That's right. So I think we should punish them, but they are either have reduced or no moral blameworthiness. So this is a case where punishment is not tracking moral blameworthiness. And so, yes, and I think this is probably fairly common when people act in good faith. They come in from a different culture, and they act on good faith based on their, as far as I can tell, the best they can determine what's morally correct. And the law says, and the law is correct, that, look, you just got it wrong. We say, look, we're going to punish you. You're not blameworthy, but
you still go to jail.
The punishment system focuses on rightness and wrongness, and responsibility, not on blameworthiness or praiseworthiness.
All right. Now, regarding the two additional things that you brought, I mean, I wasn't expecting that these two topics would come, but I want to ask you, just to wrap it up, regarding animals. What's your view on what the legal status should be of someone who kills an animal? Should that person be punished or not?
So it depends on the degree to which we think utilitarian type considerations are important. I tend to think at times that they're fairly important. So if you're killing animals, and I mean, one of the problems here is, if we have any sort of crime with regard to treatment of animals, then pretty much everyone involved in factory farming has to be imprisoned fairly quickly. If we're not going to imprison people for factory farming, it's a little hard to see why we have animal cruelty laws whatsoever, because most of what people do isn't all that much worse than what goes on in factory farming. So here I would say, well, I guess it just depends on, I think, the weight we attach to utilitarian considerations. I guess I'm a little skeptical about applying too much weight to them, because there's lots of things we do which have sort of less utility or produce negative utility. But like I said, I just think we should go one way or the other. Either we are going to punish across the board, starting with factory farms, or we're not going to punish whatsoever. It's a little hard to see how do we get where we are now, which is factory farms are pretty much outside of criminal liability, but someone who's, beating their dog or starving their horse, that person, they're going to do real jail time. It's a little hard for me to see what could possibly justify that.
So the same inconsistencies that we find in pro-lifers, we may also find in animal rights people.
Yes, but they're not as severe, because they don't have these sort of afterlives. I mean, what the pro-life position, particularly the religious pro-life position, adds to it are infinite values. So there, it just swamps everything else, right? You have infinite values, and you also have most people think that persons count for more than non-human animals. So given that the pro-lifer views abortion as a slaughter of people, we're talking, sort of an obvious and strong wrong. So there, the logic of assassinating abortion doctors and charging women who procure abortion with first-degree murder becomes much stronger than cruelty to animal situations.
If I follow you correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, then you would
Sure.
say that killing a chimpanzee because the chimpanzee is autonomous is worse than killing a 9-month fetus.
So I guess it depends on whether you think the chimpanzee is morally autonomous. I tend to think they're probably in the gray
I mean, it
area.
can live on its own. It can,
Yeah, I mean, but autonomous, I mean, sort of some sort of rational self-governance or moral autonomy, ability to understand and act on moral duties. So that's what I mean by autonomous. I don't mean kind of like bodily autonomy. So, someone who has an iron lung.
But even morally, it seems to me that a chimpanzee is able to be altruistic. I mean, biologists have documented behaviors of altruism amongst primates and other species. So morally, the chimpanzee would be able to have, let's say, more altruistic behavior and more moral autonomy than a 9-month-old fetus who's just laying there in the womb and doing nothing.
Yes, that is right. And in virtue of the features that the chimpanzee has at the time. So I think that's correct.
And, and is the implication then that someone who kills a chimpanzee, then that's a worse offense than someone who commits an abortion? Because you're saying, well, even though the chimpanzee may not be fully morally autonomous, it has a higher degree than the fetus.
Yes. So I do think that the person did a worse thing. So I think that to the extent that the law should have something like a retributivist account where punishment should be proportional to the wrongness of your act, then killing a fetus would be worse. Killing a chimpanzee would warrant a more severe punishment than killing a 9-month-old fetus. Yes, right. I think that's right. Yeah. Now, there's an issue as to whether or not punishment should track proportionality, but to the extent that's the case, then yes. And I think it's a fairly strong intuition, and most people have it, to quite a strong degree, that punishment should be proportional.
Sure.
That, we shouldn't let people out of very severe crimes just because it's efficient to do so, or, severely punish double parking, because it's efficient to do so.
All right, and the final issue that I was bringing forth was the issue about the people who are severely mentally retarded. What do you think the law should say about people who mistreat them or even kill them?
So I think they should treat the law should handle in the same way that you handle other individuals with the same cognitive or emotional ability. So however you think that you should punish people who mistreat or kill chimpanzees or gorillas, that's how we should treat people who mistreat or kill cognitively disabled human beings. That is because what grounds their rights or their value would seem to be at the same level. Now, I know people find that horrendous, but it's a little hard to see what the objection is, unless you were to think that what makes you have rights or makes you have value is simply be a human being. And again, this just seems to be morally arbitrary. Imagine they had a Wookiee from Star Wars and he had the same cognitive and emotional capacity that we do. It's a little hard to say, well, he doesn't have the rights that we have or doesn't have the importance that we have because he's of a different biological category. Why would we think that? So I think, look, we should treat individuals with the same level of cognitive and emotional ability, at least insofar as it relates to either well-being or autonomy, in a similar manner.
So the implication here would be, if I kill a stranger who has full mental capacity, I should get a tougher sentence than if I kill, let's say, my own daughter who is mentally retarded.
Yes.
All right.
What's your position on this?
No, I don't know, Professor. I'm learning from you.
That's not true. You've been doing an excellent job of asking questions, obviously, so.
This is the reason why I do podcasts, because I'm still trying to figure this out. I see the logical reasoning behind all this, and I'm sure you've stated maybe the premises that you've stated, maybe they can be questioned, but the validity of the argument is there, obviously. If the premises that you state are true, the conclusion that you're stating is also true. So you're biting the bullet, but it has to be bitten. But of course, I hope you understand, and I suppose that you run into this all the time, that your conclusions on an intuitive level are very counterintuitive, or there's a yuck factor involved. And I mean, I don't know whether or not we should trust the yuck factor, up to what degree. I mean, I know that most philosophers would say no, we should not trust it, but it is repulsive to a large extent. So does repulsion have a place in moral judgment? That's a big question.
I think we're both. And I do think it's actually it has some indication of truth. So I do think the yuck factor, counterintuitive, is a reason to doubt a position. I just think the reasons for having it are very strong. I should mention that I actually have a number of friends who are very extraordinarily bright pro-lifers, and I presented them with these arguments, and it wasn't clear where they disagreed with it. I mean, they said, particularly with the assassinating abortion doctors, they thought, there's something wrong. I'm not sure. The dominant response I get from them when I say, why shouldn't pro-lifers assassinate abortion doctors? They're as a practical matter, we're more likely to get rid of abortion if we don't piss off the American people. So it's not a very good strategy, but it's not clear they really think that it's wrong. In terms of the afterlife, they tend to rely on something like divine command theory. They'd say, well, it's a pretty good argument, not sure where it fails, but God's told us not to do so. So they kind of rely on that sort of argument to fight off the, you're guaranteeing your fetus is going to heaven. One, I ask, well, where does God tell you this? But
no, and even religious people, sometimes they may flip it around to play it in their favor. There's a guy by the name of William Lane Craig, and I don't know if you've ever heard of him, right?
Oh yeah, I've read his stuff and I've seen him debate. Yeah.
All right, so once they approach him and say, how can you justify, if what the Bible narrates is true about the conquest of Canaan, the genocide that was committed against the Canaanites?
Sure.
And he was saying, well, I mean, these people were practicing human sacrifice and they were, evildoers and so on. Okay. And what about the children? And then he says, well, we sent them directly to heaven, so we did them a favor. I say, well, wait a minute. I mean, that's exactly that's exactly what they refuse to accept when someone like you bring it up in the issue of abortion, right?
Right. That's right. Yeah.
So not very consistent at all.
And in support of what you're saying, it depends on the context, right? So if you're not talking about these things, and someone, you kind of, which is very sad, very real tragedy, a woman miscarries her fetus, and in that context, people say, well, your fetus is going to heaven, so you can at least rest. Sure, you at least can hope that your fetus is going to heaven, or your fetus is going to have. So there they'll say it, but then when you bring it to the other context, suddenly they don't want to draw the same implication, right? So yeah. So I absolutely agree with you. In context A, the assumptions that I'm making are fairly common and sort of inoffensive. And then you bring them into this context, and suddenly they become, dubious and offensive and problematic. It's like discussing the beginning of life, right? So, qua religious person, you think, well, you're a soul, you're a thinking thing, but qua, zygote and embryo, you begin to exist at conception, even though you're not thinking then. And you think, well, which is it? Is it that the thinking is essential to you, and or at least the capacity thing is essential to you, and that's why you exist in the afterlife, or is it not?
Right.
Think, well, you can't be an animalist when discussing fetuses, and a soul theorist or a brain theorist when discussing the afterlife.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Well, Professor Stephen Kershnar, it's been my pleasure. Let me share once again the cover of your book so that our viewers, when they see it in the bookstore, they know what we're talking about. So does the pro-life worldview make sense? Abortion, health, and violence against abortion doctors. All the best, Professor, and I look forward to speaking with you again on another topic.
Okay, so just very quickly, I really appreciate it. It was an excellent interview. I had a lot of fun with it, and just a real pleasure. Fantastic questions. So,
all right, indeed.
Real pleasure.
All right, all the best.
Okay, you too. Thanks again. Really appreciate it.